Hello everyone, and welcome back to Project Moon Audiobooks. This is part 2 of Hellscreen by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Enjoy. And you actually couldn't say that such a thing was out of the question, for it did seem that Yoshihide's sole purpose in calling the apprentice to his studio that night had been to set the owl on him and draw him trying to escape. Thus, when the apprentice caught that glimpse of his master at work, he felt his arms come up to protect his head and heard an incoherent scream escape his throat as he slumped down against the sliding door in the corner of the room. In that same instant, Yoshihide himself cried out and jumped to his feet, whereupon the beating of the owl's wings grew faster and louder, and there came the clatter of something falling over and a tearing sound. Having covered his head in terror, the apprentice now raised it again to find that the room had gone pitch dark, and he heard Yoshihide's angry voice calling to the other apprentices. Eventually, there was a far-off cry in response, and soon an apprentice rushed in with a lantern held high. In its sooty-smelling glow, the boy saw the tripod collapsed on the floor and the mats and planking soaked in the oil of the overturned lamp. He saw the owl, too, beating one wing in apparent pain as it flopped around the room. On the far side of the table, looking stunned, Yoshihide was raising himself from the floor and muttering something incomprehensible. And no wonder! That black snake was tightly coiled around the owl from neck to tail and over one wing. The apprentice had probably knocked the jar over as he slumped to the floor, and when the snake crawled out, the owl must have made the mistake of trying to grab it in its talons, only to give rise to this struggle. The two apprentices gaped at the bizarre scene and at each other until, with a silent bow to the master, they slipped out of the room. What happened to the owl and snake after that? No one knows. This was by no means the only such incident. I forgot to mention that it was the beginning of autumn when his lordship commanded Yoshihide to paint the Hellscreen. From then until the end of winter, the apprentices were continually subjected to their master's frightening behavior. At that point, however, something seemed to interfere with Yoshihide's work on the screen. An even deeper layer of gloom came to settle over him, and he spoke to his assistants in markedly harsher tones. The screen was perhaps 8/10 finished, but it showed no further signs of progress. Indeed, Yoshihide occasionally seemed to be on the verge of painting over those parts that he had already completed. No one knew what he was finding so difficult about the screen, and what's more, no one tried to find out. Stung by those earlier incidents, his apprentices felt as if they were locked in a cage with a tiger or a wolf, and they found ways to keep their distance from the master. For that reason, I have little to tell you about that period. The only unusual thing I can think of is that the hard-headed old codger suddenly turned weepy. People would often see him shedding tears when he was alone. An apprentice told me that one day he walked into the garden and saw the master standing on the veranda, gazing blankly at the sky with its promise of spring, his eyes full of tears. Embarrassed for the old man, the apprentice says he silently withdrew. Don't you find it odd that this arrogant man, who went so far as to sketch a corpse on the roadside for his 5 levels of rebirth, would cry like an infant just because the painting of the screen wasn't going as well as he wanted it to? In any case, while Yoshihide was madly absorbed in his work on the screen, his daughter began to show increasing signs of melancholy, until the rest of us could see that she was often fighting back her tears. A pale, reserved, sad-faced girl to begin with, she took on a genuinely mournful aspect as her lashes grew heavy and shadows began to form around her eyes. This gave rise to all sorts of speculation, that she was worried about her father, or that she was suffering the pangs of love. But soon, people were saying that it was all because his lordship was trying to bend her to his will. Then the gossiping ground to a halt, as though everyone had suddenly forgotten about her. A certain event occurred at that time. Well after the first watch of the night, I was walking down an outdoor corridor when the monkey Yoshihide came flying at me from out of nowhere and started tugging at my trouser skirts. As I recall it, this was one of those warm, early spring nights when you expect at any time now to be catching the romantic fragrance of plum blossoms in the pale moonlight. But what did I see in the moon's faint glow? It was the monkey baring its white fangs, wrinkling up its nose, and shrieking with almost manic intensity. An eerie chill was only 3 parts of what I felt. The other 7 parts were anger at having my new trousers yanked at like that, and I considered kicking the beast aside and continuing on my way. I quickly changed my mind, however, recalling the case of the samurai who had earned the young master's displeasure by tormenting the monkey. And besides, the way the monkey was behaving, there was obviously something wrong. I therefore gave up trying to resist and allowed myself to be pulled several paces farther. Where the corridor turned a corner, the pale surface of his lordship's pond could be seen stretching off through the darkness beyond a gently drooping pine. When the animal led me to that point, my ears were assaulted by the frantic, yet strangely muffled sounds of what I took to be a struggle in a nearby room. All else was hushed. I heard no voices, no sounds but the splash of a fish leaping in the mingled moonlight and fog. The sound of the struggle brought me up short. If this was an intruder, I resolved, I would teach him a lesson, and, holding my breath, I edged closer to the sliding door. My approach, however, was obviously too slow and cautious for the monkey. Yoshihide scampered around me in circles, once, twice, 3 times, then bounded up to my shoulder with a strangled cry. Instinctively, I jerked my head aside to avoid being scratched. The monkey dug its claws into my sleeve to keep from slipping down. This sent me staggering, and I stumbled backward, slamming against the door. Now I could no longer hesitate. I shot the door open and crouched to spring in beyond the moonlight's edge. At that very moment, something rose up to block my view. With a start, I realized it was a woman. She flew toward me as if someone had flung her out of the room. She nearly hit me, but instead she tumbled forward and, why I could not tell, went down on one knee before me, trembling and breathless, and staring up at me as if at some terrifying sight. I am sure I need not tell you it was Yoshihide's daughter. That night, however, my eyes beheld her with a new vividness, as though she were an utterly different person. Her eyes were huge and shining, and her cheeks seemed to be burning red. Her disheveled clothes gave her an erotic allure that contrasted sharply with her usual childish innocence. Could this actually be the daughter of Yoshihide? I wondered. That frail-looking girl, so modest and self-effacing in all things. Leaning against the sliding wooden door, I stared at this beautiful girl in the moonlight, and then, as if they were capable of pointing, I flicked my eyes toward the hurried footsteps receding into the distance to ask her soundlessly, "Who was that?" The girl bit her lip and shook her head in silence. I could see she felt deeply mortified. I bent over her and, speaking softly next to her ear, now put my question into words. "Who was that?" But again she refused to answer, and would only shake her head. Indeed, she bit her lip harder than ever, as tears gathered on her long lashes. Born stupid, I can never understand anything that isn't perfectly obvious, and so I had no idea what to say to her. I could do nothing but stand there, feeling as if my only purpose was to listen to the wild beating of her heart. Of course, one thing that kept me silent was the conviction that it would be wrong of me to question her any further. How long this went on, I do not know, but eventually I slid shut the door and gently told the girl, "Go to your room now." Her agitation seemed to have subsided somewhat. Assailed by an uneasy feeling that I had seen something I was not meant to see, and a sense of shame toward anyone and no one in particular, I began to pad my way back up the corridor. I had hardly walked 10 paces, however, when again I felt a tug, a timid one, at the skirt of my trousers. I whirled around, startled. But what do you think it was? I looked down to find the monkey Yoshihide prostrating himself at my feet, hands on the floor like a human being, bowing over and over in thanks, his golden bell ringing. Perhaps 2 weeks went by after that. All of a sudden, Yoshihide arrived at the mansion to beg a personal audience with his lordship. He probably dared do such a thing despite his humble station because he had long been in his lordship's special favor. His lordship rarely allowed anyone to come into his presence, but that day, as so often before, he assented readily to Yoshihide's request and had him shown in without a moment's delay. The man wore his usual reddish-brown robe and tall black soft hat. His face revealed a new level of sullenness, but he went down on all fours before his lordship, and at length, eyes down, he began to speak in husky tones. "I come into your honored presence this day, my lord,
regarding the screen bearing images of hell which his lordship ordered me to paint. I have applied myself to it day and night, outdone myself, such that my efforts have begun to bear fruit, and it is largely finished."
This is excellent news. I am very pleased. Even as his lordship spoke these words, however, his voice seemed oddly lacking in power and vitality.
"No, my lord, I am afraid the news is anything but excellent,"
said Yoshihide, his eyes still fastened on the floor in a way that hinted at anger.
"The work may largely be finished, but there is still a part that I am unable to paint."
"What? Unable to paint?"
"Indeed, sir. As a rule, I can only paint what I have seen, or even if I succeed in painting something unknown to me, I myself cannot be satisfied with it. This is the same as not being able to paint it. Does his lordship not agree?"
As his lordship listened to Yoshihide's words, his face gradually took on a mocking smile. "Which would mean that if you wanted to paint a screen depicting hell, you would have to have seen hell itself."
"Exactly, my lord. In the great fire some years ago, though, I saw flames with my own eyes that I could use for those of the hell of searing heat. In fact, I succeeded with my Fudo of twisting flames only because I experienced that fire. I believe my lord is familiar with the painting."
"What about sinners, though? And hell wardens? You have never seen those, have you?" His lordship challenged Yoshihide with one question after another, as though he had not heard Yoshihide's words.
"I have seen a person bound in iron chains," said Yoshihide, "and I have done a detailed sketch of someone being tormented by a monstrous bird. No, I think it cannot be said that I have never seen sinners being tortured. And as for hell wardens," said Yoshihide, breaking into an eerie smile, "my eyes have beheld them any number of times as I drift between sleeping and waking. The bull-headed ones, the horse-headed ones, the three-faced, six-armed devils. Almost every night they come to torture me with their soundless clapping hands, their voiceless gaping mouths. No, they are not the ones I am having so much difficulty painting."
I suspect this shocked even his lordship. For a long while he only glared at Yoshihide until, with an angry twitch of the brow, he spat out, "All right, then. What is it that you say you are unable to paint?"
"In the center of the screen, falling from the sky, I want to paint an aristocrat's carriage, its cabin woven of the finest split palm leaf."
As he spoke, Yoshihide raised himself to look directly at his lordship for the first time, and with a penetrating gaze. I had heard that Yoshihide could be like a madman where painting was concerned. To me, the look in his eyes at that moment was terrifying in that very way.
"In the carriage, a voluptuous noblewoman writhes in agony, her long black hair tossing in the ferocious flames. Her face, well, perhaps she contorts her brows and casts her gaze skyward towards the ceiling of the cabin as she chokes on the rising clouds of smoke. Her hands might tear at the cloth streamers of the carriage blinds as she struggles to ward off the shower of sparks raining down upon her. Around her swarm fierce, carnivorous birds, perhaps a dozen or more, snapping their beaks in anticipation. Oh, my lord, it is this image of the noblewoman in the carriage, that I am unable to paint."
"And therefore—" His lordship seemed to be deriving an odd sort of pleasure from this, as he urged Yoshihide to continue. But Yoshihide himself, red lips trembling as with a fever, could only repeat, as if in a dream,
"This is what I am unable to paint."
Then suddenly, all but biting into his own words, he cried,
"I beg you, my lord, have your men set a carriage on fire. Let me watch the flames devour its frame and its woven cabin, and, if possible—"
A dark cloud crossed his lordship's face, but no sooner had it passed than he broke into a loud cackle. He was still cackling with laughter when he spoke. "Possible? I'll do whatever you want. Don't waste time worrying about what is possible." His lordship's words filled me with a terrible foreboding, and in fact his appearance at that moment was anything but ordinary. White foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, his eyebrows convulsed into jagged bolts of lightning, It was as if his lordship himself had become infused with Yoshihide's madness. And no sooner had he finished speaking than laughter, endless laughter, exploded from his throat once again. "Ha ha 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 ha! I'll burn a carriage for you," he said, "and I'll have a voluptuous woman inside it, dressed in a noblewoman's robes. She will die writhing with agony in flames and black smoke. I have to salute you, Yoshihide. Who could have thought of such a thing but the greatest painter in the land?" Yoshihide went pale when he heard this, and for a time the only part of him that moved was his lips. He seemed to be gasping for breath. Then, as though all the muscles of his body had gone limp at once, he crumpled forward with his hands on the matted floor again. "1,000 thanks to you, my lord," Yoshihide said with rare humility, his voice barely audible. Perhaps the full horror of his own plan had come all too clear to him as he heard it spelled out in his lordship's words. Only this one time in my life did I ever think of Yoshihide as a man to be pitied. 2 or 3 nights later, his lordship summoned Yoshihide as promised to witness the burning of the carriage. He held the event not at the Horikawa mansion, but outside the capital, at his late younger sister's mountain retreat, widely known as the Palace of the Melting Snows. No one had lived at this palace for a very long time. Its spacious gardens had gone wild, and the desolate site must have given rise to all sorts of rumors, many about his lordship's sister, who had actually died there. People used to say that on moonless nights her ladyship's broad-skirted scarlet trousers would glide eerily along the outdoor corridor, never touching the floor. And no wonder there were such stories. The palace was lonely enough in the daytime, but once the sun set it became downright unnerving. The garden stream would murmur ominously in the darkness, and herons would swoop in the starlight like monstrous creatures. As it happened, the carriage burning took place on one of those pitch-dark, moonless nights. Oil lamps revealed his lordship seated in cross-legged ease on the veranda. Beneath a turquoise robe, he wore deep lavender-patterned trousers. On a thick round mat, edged in white brocade, his position was of course elevated above the half-dozen or so attendants who surrounded him. One among them appeared most eager to be of service to his lordship, a burly samurai who had distinguished himself in the campaign against the northern barbarians some years earlier. He was said to have survived starvation by eating human flesh, after which he had the strength to tear out the antlers of a living stag with his bare hands. On this night he knelt in stern readiness below the veranda, in the scabbard at his armored waist, a sword tipped up and back like a gull's tail, ready to be drawn at a moment's notice. These men presented a strangely terrifying, almost dreamlike spectacle. The lamplight flickering in the night wind turned them all dark one moment, bright the next. And then there was the carriage itself. Even without an ox attached to its long black shafts, their ends resting on the usual low bench that tilted the whole slightly forward, it stood out against the night, its tall cabin woven of the finest split palm leaf, exactly as Yoshihide had requested. Truly, a conveyance worthy of his imperial majesty, or the most powerful ministers of state. When I saw its gold fittings gleaming like stars in the sky, and considered what was soon to happen to this lavishly appointed vehicle, a shiver went through me in spite of the warm spring night. As for what might be inside the carriage, there was no way to tell. Its lovely blinds, woven of still green bamboo and edged in patterned cloth, had been rolled down tight, and around it alert-looking conscripts stood guard, holding flaming torches and showing their concern that too much smoke might be drifting towards his lordship on the veranda. Yoshihide himself was situated at some remove, kneeling on the ground directly opposite the veranda. He wore what seemed to be his usual reddish-brown robe and tall black soft hat, and he looked especially small and shabby, as though the star-filled sky were a weight pressing down upon him. Behind him knelt another person in an outfit like his, probably an apprentice he had brought along. With them crouching down low in the darkness like that, I could not make out the color of their robes from my place below the veranda. Midnight was approaching, I believe. It felt as if the darkness enveloping the garden were silently watching us all breathing, the only sound an occasional rush of night wind, each gust wafting toward us the resinous smell from the pine smoke of the torches. His lordship remained silent for some moments, observing the mysterious scene. But then, edging forward where he sat, he cried sharply, "Yoshihide!" Yoshihide may have said some word in response, but to my ears it sounded like nothing so much as a moan. "Tonight, Yoshihide, I am going to burn a carriage for you, as requested." When he said this, his lordship glanced at the men around him. I thought I saw a meaningful smile pass between him and certain of them. Of course, it could have been my imagination. Now Yoshihide seemed to be timidly raising his head and looking up toward the veranda, but still he waited, saying nothing. "I want you to look at this," his lordship said. "This is my carriage, the one I use every day. You know it well, I'm sure. I will now have it set afire in order that you may see the hell of searing heat here on earth before your eyes." His lordship reverted to silence, and his eyes flashed another signal to his men. Then, with sudden vehemence, he cried, "Chained inside the carriage is a sinful woman. When we set the carriage afire, her flesh will be roasted, her bones will be charred. She will die an agonizing death. Never again will you have such a perfect model for the screen. Do not fail to watch as her snow-white flesh erupts in flames. See and remember her long black hair dancing in a whirl of sparks." His lordship sank into silence for yet a third time, but whatever could have been in his mind? Now all he did was laugh soundlessly, his shoulders quaking. "Never again will there be a sight like this, Yoshihide. I shall join you in observing it. All right, men, raise the blind. Let Yoshihide see the woman inside." On hearing this command, one of the conscripts, torch held high, strode up to the carriage, stretched out his free hand, and whipped the blind up. The torch crackled and flickered, and cast its red gleam inside. On the carriage's matted floor, cruelly chained, sat a woman. And oh, who could have failed to recognize her? Her long black hair flowed in a voluptuous band across a gorgeous robe embroidered in cherry blossoms, and the golden hairpins on top of her downcast head sparkled beautifully in the firelight. For all the difference in costuming, there was no mistaking that girlish frame, that graceful neck, where now a gag was fashioned, that touchingly modest profile. They belonged to none other than Yoshihide's daughter. I could hardly keep from crying out. Just then, the samurai kneeling across from me sprang to his feet and, pressing threateningly on his sword hilt, glared at Yoshihide. Startled by this sudden movement, I turned my gaze toward Yoshihide. He looked as if this spectacle were driving him half mad. Where he had been crouching until then, he was on his feet now and poised, arms outstretched, to run toward the carriage. Unfortunately, though, as I said before, he was in the shadows far away from me, and so I did not have a clear view of his face. My frustration lasted but a moment, however. Now, drained of color though it was, Yoshihide's face, or should I say, Yoshihide's entire form, raised aloft by some invisible power, appeared before me with such clarity it seemed to have cut its way through the surrounding darkness. For suddenly, his lordship had cried, "Burn it!" The conscripts flung their torches, and the carriage, with Yoshihide's daughter inside, burst into flame. The fire engulfed the entire carriage. The purple roof tassels blew aside, then clouds of smoke swirled aloft, stark white against the blackness of the night, and finally a shower of sparks spurted upwards with such terrifying force that in a single instant the blinds, the side panels, and the roof's metal fittings were ripped off in the blast and sent flying. Still more horrible was the color of the flames that licked the latticed cabin vents before shooting skyward, as though, might I say, the sun itself had crashed to earth, spewing its heavenly fire in all directions. As close as I had come to crying out before, now I could only gape in mute awe at the horrifying spectacle. But what of the girl's father? I will never forget the look on Yoshihide's face at that moment. He had started towards the carriage on impulse, but halted when the flames flared up. He then stood there with arms outstretched, eyes devouring the smoke and flames that enveloped the carriage. In the firelight that bathed him from head to toe, I could see every feature of his ugly, wrinkled face. His wide, staring eyes, his contorted lips, the twitching flesh of his cheeks, all drew a vivid picture of the shock, the terror, and the sorrow that traversed Yoshihide's heart by turns. Such anguish, I suspect, would not be seen even on the face of a convicted thief about to have his head cut off, or the guiltiest sinner about to face the judgment of the 10 kings of hell. Even the powerful samurai went pale at the sight, and stole a fearful glance at his lordship above him. But what of his lordship himself? Biting his lip and smiling strangely now and then, he stared straight ahead, never taking his eyes off the carriage. And the girl in the carriage? I don't think I have the courage to describe in detail what she looked like then. The pale whiteness of her upturned face as she choked on the smoke, the tangled length of her hair as she tried to shake the flames from it, the beauty of her cherry blossom robe as it burst into flame. It was all so cruel, so terrible, especially at one point when the night wind rushed down from the mountain to sweep away the smoke. The sight of her against a flaming background of red flecked with gold dust, gnawing at her gag, writhing as if to snap the chains that bound her. It was enough to make our flesh creep, not only mine but the powerful samurai's as well, as if the tortures of hell were being pictured right there before our eyes. Just then, the night wind gusted once more, rustling the branches of the garden's trees, or so it seemed to me, and, I am sure, to everyone else. Such a sound seemed to race through the dark sky, and in that instant, some black thing shot from the palace roof into the blazing carriage. It traveled in a perfectly straight line, like a ball that has been kicked, neither touching the earth nor arcing through space. And as the carriage's burning side lattices collapsed inward, glowing as if coated in crimson lacquer, the thing grasped the girl's straining shoulders and hurled a long, piercing, and inexpressibly anguished scream out beyond the billowing smoke. Another scream followed, and then a third, until we all found ourselves crying out with it. For though it had been left tethered back at the Horikawa mansion, what we saw now clinging to the girl's shoulders against a flaming backdrop was the monkey Yoshihide. We could see the monkey for only the briefest moment, though. A fountain of sparks shot up to the sky like gold dust and black lacquer, and then not only the monkey, but the girl, too, was shrouded in black smoke. Now in the middle of the garden there was only a carriage of fire, seething in flames with a terrible roar. No, pillar of fire might better describe this horrific conflagration boiling up to the starry heavens. But, oh, how strange it was to see the painter now, standing absolutely rigid before the pillar of fire. Yoshihide, who only a few moments earlier had seemed to be suffering the torments of hell, stood there with his arms locked across his chest, as if he had forgotten even the presence of his lordship, his whole wrinkled face suffused now with an inexpressible radiance, the radiance of religious ecstasy. I could have sworn that the man's eyes were no longer watching his daughter dying in agony, that instead the gorgeous colors of flames and the sight of a woman suffering in them were giving him joy beyond measure. The most wondrous thing was not that he watched his only daughter's death throes with apparent joy, but rather that Yoshihide at that moment possessed a strange, inhuman majesty that resembled the rage of the king of beasts himself, as you might see him in a dream. For this reason, although I might have been imagining it, the countless night birds that flew around us squawking in alarm at each new eruption of flames seemed to keep their distance from Yoshihide's tall black hat. Perhaps even these insentient birds could see the mysterious grandeur that hung above Yoshihide like a radiant aura. If the birds could see it, how much more so the rest of us, down to the lowly conscripts, trembling inwardly, scarcely breathing, and filled with a bizarre sense of adoration. We kept our eyes fastened on Yoshihide, as if we were present at the decisive moment when a lump of stone or wood becomes a holy image of the Buddha. The carriage flames that filled the heavens with a roar, Yoshihide under the spell of the flames, transfixed. What sublimity! What rapture! But among us, only one, his lordship, looked on as if transformed into another person, his noble countenance drained of color, the corners of his mouth flecked with foam, hands clutching his knees through his lavender trousers as he panted like a beast in need of water. Word soon spread that his lordship had burned the carriage that night in the Palace of the Melting Snows, and there seemed to have been many who were highly critical of the event. First of all came the question of Yoshihide's daughter. Why had his lordship chosen to burn her alive? The rumor most often heard was that he had done it out of spite for her rejection of his love. I am certain, however, that he did it to punish the twisted personality of an artist who would go so far as to burn a carriage and kill a human being to complete the painting of a screen. In fact, I overheard his lordship saying as much himself. And then there was Yoshihide, whose stony heart was also apparently the topic of much negative commentary. How, after seeing his own daughter burned alive, could he want to finish the screen painting? Some cursed him as a beast in human guise who had forgotten a father's love for the sake of a picture. One who allied himself with this opinion was his reverence, the abbot of Yokawa, who always used to say, "Excel in his art though he might, if a man does not know the 5 virtues, he can only end up in hell." A month went by, and the screen with its images of hell was finished at last. Yoshihide brought it to the mansion that very day, and humbly presented it for his lordship's inspection. His reverence happened to be visiting at the time, and I am certain that he was shocked at the sight of the horrible firestorm blasting through it. Until he actually saw the screen, he was glowering at Yoshihide. But then he slapped his knee and exclaimed, "What magnificent work!" I can still see the bitter smile on his lordship's face when he heard those words. Almost no one spoke ill of Yoshihide after that, at least not in the mansion. Could it be because all who saw the screen, even those who had always hated him, were struck by strangely solemn feelings when they witnessed the tortures of the hell of searing heat in all their reality? By then, however, Yoshihide numbered among those who were no longer of this world. The night after he finished the screen, he tied a rope to a beam in his room and hanged himself. I suspect that, having sent his daughter on ahead to the other world, he cannot bear to go on living here as if nothing had happened. His body lies buried in the ruins of his home. The little stone marker is probably so cloaked in moss now, after decades of exposure to the wind and rain, that no one can tell whose grave it is any more.